Every character in Genshin Impact has the moveset consisting of 3 inputs: basic attack, elemental skill, and elemental burst. Amidst the increasingly more complex kits, this law has remained fundamentally intact all throughout the years and has contributed to the game's low barrier to entry and streamlined gameplay. On one hand, you could surmise the narrow constraints that entails can make the game feel too superficial and lack as much nuance as a more sophisticated title. But on the other, I actually think Hoyo isn't doing half bad when it comes to making unique playstyles, despite characters having effectively only 2 buttons to press. Although it comes with the undesired consequence of ability descriptions reading like Yu-Gi-Oh cards, but I digress. The ruling goes as follows: basic attacks and by extension charged and plunging attacks are meant to serve as a unit's consistent means of dealing damage. Meanwhile, the elemental skills integrated into their normal playstyle, typically having a short cooldown, whereas an elemental burst is intended to serve as the keystone of a character's kit, their coup de grace, the shining aspect of them. Much of Genshin's earlier roster followed that train of thought. Elemental skills were either meant to set up the burst or enable the character to do their thing, while the burst would oftentimes be the sole reason for a character's power. In recent times though, you may have noticed a shift in the opposite direction. The skill appears to represent the character's role more than the burst. That's what I want to talk about for today. I want to discuss what I believe to be the rise of the elemental skill meta. What are the key distinctions between an elemental skill and burst, and more importantly, why they're going in this direction. Really quickly, I have something important I want to talk about. I got a new phone, specifically the Red Magic 10 Pro, which happens to be our sponsor for today. You guys might recall I got the Red Magic 9 Pro last year, and they were nice enough to send me the newest model. As I'm sure most of you know by now, the Red Magic series is a line of smartphones known for having displays and performance optimized for gaming, and they just came out with the 10 Pro, the first phone ever to have a full 1.5K display paired with one of the strongest batteries a phone can carry, 7050 mAh to be specific. It also comes with a 1.25mm frame border and bezel with a 95.3% screen-to-body ratio, alongside a liquid metal cooling technology on par with gaming laptops. As you can tell by me showing the phone, it's got a really sleek design with a flat rear panel and no camera bumps, even without a case. The phone also comes with built-in shoulder triggers to give you more buttons to map when gaming. Speaking of gaming, this thing has a cooling fan that also turns on while running games, which you can see in the back of the phone, and it actually looks pretty cool. To give you the best experience a mobile device can give, the Red Magic 10 Pro comes with a Snapdragon 8 Elite processor, a 144Hz display, and master-level audio quality speakers. There's honestly so much to go through, but point being, it's the best gaming phone, especially for the price. Able to run all kinds of mobile titles, from Wild Rift, Minecraft, Brawl Stars, to popular gachas like Genshin, Star Awuwa, ZZZ, all of which you can find in the game space, which is back once again. And there's even an AI assistant named Mora who can help you navigate all the features and plugins on deck. If you're still unsure as to what to get for Christmas, try asking for the Red Magic 10 Pro. You can use my link on screen or in the description. Thanks again to Red Magic for sponsoring the video, but for now, back on topic. At the start of Genshin, if you look at all the units presented throughout version 1, characters typically adhere to the rule of the elemental burst taking up the bulk of the power budget. Any exceptions typically go for an even split, where the elemental skill and burst are equally conducive to their gameplay. Looking at a few examples, Bennett, Xiangling, and Xingqiu are notorious examples of burst impact, wherein their elemental skills, while not terrible, appear to exist for the sole purpose of supplying energy for their elemental burst or giving them something to do while they wait for their burst to come back up. On a broader scope, you tend to see characters with a skill focused on being woven into the normal attack string, and their ultimates either taking the form of a big steroid, as seen in the likes of Noelle, Shao, Klee, and Razor, or a massive skill attack like Child, Keqing, Ganyu, Hu Tao, and Eula. I could say the only 4 whose skill expressly took precedence over their burst were Child, Chongli, Keqing, and Hu Tao. As we enter version 2, most of its characters were trained on their burst being a core part of their game plan, Raiden Shogun, Ayaka, Toma, Ito, Shinhe, and Yelan being notable examples. But around this time, a number of units began to come out with gameplays that revolved around their skill more than their burst. Sometimes you can go the entire time playing them without ever using said burst. Yoimiya, Yaimiko, Shinobu, and Kokomi. In the case of Kokomi, it depends on what team she's on. For my playstyle, I mostly use her ultimate just to keep the jellyfish on field a bit longer. There was still a fair balance between burst and non-burst oriented units around this time. Coming into version 3, the bulk of a character's playstyle began to switch from playing for the burst to either not playing for it whatsoever, or the burst playing for an altogether different win condition. Sino, DMC, Candice, Farazan, and Kaveh were about the only characters in all of version 3 who still followed the motif of elemental burst carrying the bulk of their power budget. Everyone else either had their burst carry the same equity as their elemental skill, or sometimes even less. More units with their skill being the linchpin of their toolkit became the norm. Nahida, Wanderer, Nilu, Dia, except for her it's for all the wrong reasons, and then you have a smaller subset of characters with the official effect, where their burst is primarily there to facilitate their skill, or some other aspect of their kit like I'll Hate Them, Yao Yao, Layla, etc. On that note, supports back in version 1 used to have only one aspect of their kit house, the buffs, healing, and whatnot, once again typically their burst. The skill was just for a battery or a small bit of damage output. Now you're beginning to see supports with skills and ultimates that are equally as integral to their contributions to the team. Baiju's skill doing the healing and burst doing the shielding, along with more healing, Miko with the attack speed on skill and healing on burst, and so on. By version 4, you can begin to observe a very significant shift in character design, coinciding with Fontaine being the alternative playstyle version. Linny's a charge attacker first and foremost. Neuvillette also a charge attacker, and even though his burst actually does good damage, its only purpose is to get more droplets on field. Risley's also an attacker. Furina's skill and burst are roughly about equal in value, give or take. Navi as an elemental skill-focused attacker. Xinyun, I believe, is the only one to be a traditional burst-oriented support. Chiyoti's all skill, with their burst merely being a screen nuke. Arlecchino is skill and normal attack-oriented. Clarent is also skill-oriented. Sichuan skill-oriented, and Emily effectively has 2 skills, as their burst behaves identically to Fischl's, where it spawns a copy of her skill after being used. Throughout version 4, evidently, elemental bursts are taking a backseat in favor of a character's skill, basic attack, or some other aspect, a trend that's been continuing even into version 5. Okay, I mean, it depends on what you value. For Milani, her skill gives her consistent output while her burst is for damage per screenshotting. Occasionally, you'll find yourself valuing one over the other. For Kanish, his burst effectively exists to facilitate his skill. Shiloden, it depends. Pragmatically, her skill carries more equity in her kit. That's the part of her most people will be considering when deciding who to field in a hypothetical party, whereas the healing's more icing on the cake. Chaska's definitely elemental skill based. On that note, characters who go down this route usually have an elemental burst that does nothing but deal damage, maybe with a supplementary effect. Clarent, nuke, Arlecchino nuke, Chiyori nuke, Risley nuke, Neuvillette nuke, even Sichuan's a nuke, Milani nuke, Chaska nuke. When I say nuke, I mean the active component just deals damage. Again, some leave stuff behind like Neuvillette's droplets or Arlecchino's skill refresh. Granted, I know I spent most of version 5 talking about 5 stars. Auroran is one of our new releases, and he's very much an elemental burst kind of guy. The trend is still pronounced though. Now that we're all caught up, let's talk about what the key differences are between a skill and burst. There are basically just 2. Firstly, elemental skills on average have a shorter cooldown than elemental bursts. There are few, if any, units in Genshin with a burst that activates more often than their skill, since even though I went on to establish that new units are becoming less burst-oriented, it still doesn't change the fact that an elemental burst is conceptually implied to be the big ability for a character, underscored by their second difference. There's an additional cost tied to a unit's elemental burst: energy. Now, let's just say I know a guy who knows a guy who knows a guy who knows a guy who knows a guy who took a look at things to come, and it just so happens that the mechanics of elemental bursts are going to change very soon. But insofar as the present and beforehand are concerned, energy tends to be the more influential factor barring your access to it. It's for that reason virtually every character guide, especially old ones, mention a recommended energy recharge amount per character, and to count for teams whether going solo or with a party member of the same element. It's a huge component of optimizing a team. For example, Ito used to need a third Geo character because both he and Goro have energy issues if it's only them. 9 times out of 10, the reason you have 2 Hydro, 2 Pyro, 2 Electro, 2 whatever is not for the sake of elemental resonance, not entirely anyway. It's primarily to make the energy requirement more lenient for both of them, and I think Koi was trying to go down the route of elemental skills or other forms of combat for the express purpose of making units more consistent. Characters with elemental skill-focused gameplay have a few advantages over those with elemental burst-focused gameplay. Most damage dealers in Genshin come with a steroid ability or stance, something that temporarily enhances their power, in which they can be allowed to undergo their attack rotation. You have one group of characters with elemental skills containing the steroid: Hutal, Child, Arlecchino, Clarent, Risley, and then you have another group with elemental bursts containing that steroid: Sino, Ito, Shogun, and Shao. Elemental skill-based buffs tend to result in consistently higher presence in the metagame on average than those who need to get their burst off to get things going, for reasons I mentioned earlier. Elemental skills are just more consistent, having a lower chance of being disrupted by circumstance. For one, it's much easier to conceive a party around an elemental skill-focused unit. You don't have to be concerned with battery issues, while burst attackers do. For the longest time ever, Shell was in a bad position before Vars came out, mostly because there was no character who could adequately supplement his energy requirements without coming at the cost of DPS. Your best bet would have been Thrilling Tales on Sucrose. It was also tricky to battery himself, given that lemniscatic wind cycling generates no particles when used during his ultimate state, so you had to use it outside of it. Regardless, it resulted in painfully long periods of downtime and severely limited party building for Shell. Even after Farzan and Xinyun amended all of his battery issues, it doesn't change the fact that Shell's party versatility is close to non-existent. The only burst-oriented attacker who doesn't deal with this would be Raiden Shogun. However, she's a special case in that she has such an insane amount of energy recharge, upwards of 250%, that through sheer force of battery she can get her ultimate up consistently, and in her case the idea is mutualism, buffing her teammates who in turn buff her back, not even considering her ability to play as an off-field electro applicator for Dendro teams. Another headwind elemental burst units have to deal with is how committal they are by nature of being centered around their burst. Most burst buffs typically deactivate upon swapping out. You can see them on Klee, Kaveh, Sino, Shal, Shogun, etc. In fairness, elemental skills also deactivate, so it's not an issue endemic to just burst units. But it's because buffs typically expire upon swapping out that the aforementioned energy requirement makes them noticeably less consistent and therefore versatile. When playing a DPS unit like say Neuvillette, whose main source of attacking is charge attack, his elemental skill and burst are primarily just to get source water droplets on the field. Midway through Neuvillette's combo, if something happens that requires you to switch to your support, you can freely do so as the droplets will stay on field for a lenient amount of time. The same goes for units like Arlecchino, Alhaitham, Milani, and Chaska, who can cancel their combo midway through and swap out, then swap back in and continue where they left off with minimal downtime. Milani and Chaska only taking a couple seconds thanks to the short skill cooldowns. No such privilege exists for burst-oriented attackers. The shortest elemental burst cooldown in the game is 12 seconds, and from the roster with Z cooldown, none of them has steroid buffs. The best you'll find is 15 seconds, which compared to the usual 6 to 10 second cooldown is a fairly longer downtime. On paper, to counterbalance that, elemental burst buffs usually come with a longer duration. In most if not all cases, that is true. Shal's Bane of All Evil has a duration of 15 seconds, an incredibly long buff duration especially for the time he came out. Sino also carries a long buff duration, starting at a base of 10 but being extendable twice through the usage of his skill, up to a cap of 18. Long buff timers are indeed worth mentioning, however, it still brings to focus just how restricted those characters can be. It's a double-edged sword in that it may sound awesome for a unit to stay active for such a length of time, but for you to get the most out of it, the rest of their team has to be able to match it, which is an arduous task even now. Considering most buff durations average between 12 to 18 seconds, you also have to account for the fact that cycling through your party shaves off a few of them. Bennett's Fantastic Voyage only holds out for 12 plus 2 if you account for the linger after, but since you normally open up with his before swapping to Kasaha or Shangling or whomever to snapshot then swap to your carry, realistically your carry only gets to enjoy about 9 to 10 seconds of Bennett's Circle at most, meaning for carries with a 15 to 18 second buff, that's enough time for only about half or 2/3 their total duration. Conveniently, Shogun's rather poor duration on her burst comes with a silver lining in that she can't squeeze her entire power spike within the remaining time that Bennett gives her. It would be one thing if Genshin had Wuthering Waves buff durations that last for like 15 to 30 seconds, but the game is currently balanced around uptimes of only 8 to 15. Shogun's skill was the only one for a long time to have an uptime exceeding such a length. It wasn't until just recently with units like Nahida or the long durations on Furina, Shenyun, Shilonen, or the Cinder City artifact set that we're finally getting into buff durations exceeding 15 seconds. Even so, in practice it's more efficient to have an ability with an 8 second duration and 6 second cooldown than an ability with a 16 second duration and 12 second cooldown, as it gives a player the option to switch out between activations if and when they need to, especially given most Abyss Chambers are sectioned off into 2 waves of enemies or more. Even if you still have some time left on your burst buff, you'll have to reposition to wherever the new enemies spawn, at which point you might be forced to step away from static positioned effects like Bennett or Kazuha's buffs. Up till now, I've been mostly touching on buffs, but what about attacks like Ayaka's ultimate or Venti's ultimate? Same principle, if not even more so. One of the big problems with Venti, aside from the fact that enemies are too heavy to be lifted, is that in chambers where Venti thrives, they come in multiple waves that last for more than his vortex can be up for, making it so you have to wait a long time from one cast to the next. Skills on the other hand can be more accommodating. Navia can stagger her skill shots to have the first attack one group of enemies and the second attack another. Nahida can reapply her dendro marks to nearby enemies quickly even as new ones appear. Skills in general can be more flexible due to no energy requirement and shorter cooldowns across the board. Now, by no means I'm implying that any elemental burst focused unit is objectively worse than skill focused ones, it's all contextual. Not every character has the same power budget. Some may have an incredibly strong skill and burst, while others may have a skill and burst that are both terrible. There is a reason Bennett is still one of Genshin's most prominent characters. The effects of Circle Impact cannot be overstated. That said, I do think there are a few things they can do to help out burst-oriented units and keep the balance between them. First, it should go without saying that I think no one would complain if every burst buff attacker could maintain their buffs upon switching out. Noelle and Diluc already have this property, so it's not like they haven't done it before. Retroactively implementing it into the roster as well as continuing to do so thereafter can even out the consistency. Second, and this might be a really hot take, make it so ultimates either have a really short cooldown or no cooldown at all. Hear me out, hear me out. In Honkai Star Rail, there's no cooldown to your ultimate. If you can get it back up right away, you can effectively spam your ultimate over and over again. They even have a universal erudition mechanic known as Brain in a Vat, which instantly primes your ultimate. Seeing as how energy acts as a cooldown already, it doesn't make a lot of sense for there to be an actual cooldown for elemental bursts. Even for hyper battery efficient teams, it still takes a while to get your ultimate back up. I think a lot of characters would have their uptime concerns addressed if they only had to worry about energy, not cooldowns. Mind you, I'm aware of the possible repercussions of taking away cooldowns on some bursts, so it would not be wise to apply a blanket cooldown wipe across all units. but I do think it would be helpful for most burst-reliant characters. For clarification, I'm not against the shift towards elemental skill and basic attacks. I actually think it's awesome to see a variety of playstyles besides everyone being elemental burst oriented. I get that it's supposed to be the pièce de résistance of a character, well with the whole cutscenes they do and all, but having been a day one player, I've seen many units with otherwise great concepts that have been damaged by their painful limitations, most of which are as a result of their ultimates. It's no surprise that among all the top tier characters, one thing they all share is consistency. I only hope they can give that same concession to burst-oriented units, so they don't feel worse to play. Anyways, what are your thoughts on the rise of elemental skill characters? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. For now though, if you enjoyed the video, a like and subscribe would be much appreciated. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter @Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my other discussion videos if you haven't yet. Until next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.